Let's jump in and start retopologizing the face of my little bear here. The workflow when retopologizing is really important. There's a couple big stages that we need to be mindful of and some key ideas that are going to guide our workflow. Fundamentally, we're only going to be building half of the bear, and that's the big thing to remember. We're going to be using our mirroring tools to automatically create the other side. So, hey, I just made your life easier. We're only retopologizing half of our bear, which gives us a center line that we need to be mindful of, and we'll come and talk about that center line here in a minute. Now that we have an understanding that we're only doing half of the bear, the second step is to go in and define these major boundaries initially. We're not going to worry about how we're going to connect the boundaries yet. We're going to be mindful of that. But a definition of those boundaries is the first critical step. So let's jump in and start that process. I'm in object mode here. I'm going to go in, select my bear, and I'm going to load it as a live surface. And as a reminder here, we just need to click on that little magnet icon with the object selected. It's going to load that surface as a live surface. And now the new geometry is automatically going to be snapped to the points that are on that shape. Okay, let's fire up good old quad draw here, and I'm going to start with the eyes. Let's zoom in here, and I'm just going to put down a couple verts to start crafting an eye. Now, one of the things that I try to do right off the bat is that I try to define that north, south, east, and west location of the circle that goes around the eye just almost immediately. So I'm going to go in and I'm just going to establish those cardinal locations with a couple dots, these green dots. And I know that they're hard to see, and I apologize. I really, really wish that I could make them bigger inside of the Maya interface. You can't. So you're just going to have to trust that they're there. Okay, so I've just started to lay down some structure here. Since I have some points, I can go in now and let's create a couple more. And with the two more in there, I now have enough to make my first shape. So here's 1, 2, 3. I'm going to start pulling out the fourth edge here, holding down the tab key as I select that edge. Here's 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Excuse me, I miscounted. Here's 5. Hold down Shift 6. 7 and 8. That's a good place to begin. Now, when we're laying this information down, we want to try to get it in there as close as we can. I'm just going to create a good structure right here in the eye socket itself. I'm going to keep this pretty big, pretty chunky. What's important is that we get all this stuff connected. It's going to look weird. We want to keep our edge loops pretty raw at this point because we don't know how many edge loops we need, and oftentimes it gets really, really tough, and I mean incredibly challenging when we're trying to retopologize a surface that's got like 80 million edge loops. If we keep our loop structure really, really simple initially, it's easier, and then we can always go back in after the fact and add more resolution. We can add more geometry with our multi-cut tools and even some of the functions of the quad draw tool. Okay, so there's an 8-sider up here for the eye. Let's continue working on the nose, because I know that I'm going to need some down here as well. Still got the quad draw tool active. I'm clicking down some dots now. North, south, east, and west. I like to establish these cardinal locations pretty early on. Shoot, you can even do all of them if you'd like. I know some folks that live and breathe by these dots, and that's okay. And, whatever is easiest for you. Some folks like putting all the dots down, and then they come back over with the Shift key, and they just add the polygons in. That's good too. That's good too. There's not one way or another that's absolutely the best. There's just your way. This is absolutely a puzzle. It really is. So the easier this puzzle is for you and your brain, I think that's good. I think that's really good. All right, so I got a circle here that defines the nose. I got another loop here that defines the eyeball. Let's do the exact same thing up here for the ear. Now the ear gets a little tricky because just the angle of the mesh in relationship to my ability to tumble inside the scene itself. But I'm going to try my darndest here to get it going. Here's the south polygons. Here's the north one. And then here's the west over there. Hopefully you can see this, but I'm starting to make some big crosses here. 2 axes. This is going to orient the loops to the natural location of the model within inside of our three-dimensional scene. It just makes it a little bit easier for us to manage. It also makes it easy for us to bisect those and add the diagonals, because we already have a good indication of where all of that information is going to go. There we go. Voila, and I'm happy with that. As you go in and edit these, it's okay to make them big. Just make them consistently big. If you wanted to have your polygons be like this to define your loops, I'm cool with that. That's a really great practice. Just make them uniform. That way, when you come back in later and edit and slice these up, any sort of interior edge loop that you create is going to match the density of the polygons in that area. All right, that's a good place to go. It looks a little funky, it really does. It's supposed to. Remember, this is just basic construction of all these parts and pieces here. I want to do the exact same thing down here for the jawline. So I've established just almost quickly here with 3 poly loops, the nostril, the eye, and the ear. The next thing that we should look at are the major features that define the curvature of the primary forms of the mesh itself. And in this case, it's going to be that jawline of our bear. That's a really super critical part. So let's get that established, because this is a primary plane change inside of the mesh. So let's get some polygons in there that defines what this is going to look like. Now, I certainly could start taking these polygons down from the ear loop. I'm going to work on that a little bit later. I think what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to keep it pretty big and pretty chunky and add a polygon right there. And then I'm just going to use the extrusion system inside of the quad draw system to start flushing out and forming this jawline. Now, I don't know how many polygons I need to wrap around the underside of the jaw, so I'm going to keep it basic. I'm going to try to define it with as few polygons as I can. Holding down tab, clicking on the edge to extrude this out. When we're working on curves, remember, at the apex of the curve, the middle of the curve, we define that curve with an edge. So here's the apex of the curve of the jaw. Boom, we got an edge there. And I'm just going to take this all the way kind of up towards the mouth. Now when you get close to the nose loops, that's okay. Just make them a little bit smaller. And then try to end it right here in the center. Remember, we're going to be using the mirroring tools to do the heavy lifting for us, right? To make the other side. And we're going to straighten up all of that center line geometry later on. That's going to come in a future step. Right now, the mission is just to get everything connected in a way that makes sense. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this. I have no idea if this is going to work the way I want it to work, but we're gonna find out. You're going to find that the process of retopologizing is a process of exploration. You're going to go in thinking one thing and then very quickly discover that you're going to need some additional geometry in here. And that's okay. That's part of the process. So now that I have that jawline starting to look the way I want it to look, let's start laying down some other boundary features that I know I'm going to need to have. And specifically, I know I'm going to need to have some sort of master center line inside of the mesh itself. This is a great opportunity to start flushing out what that center line is going to be. Now, over the nose here, I have a little bit of a hump that defines the conclusion of the nose and the beginning of the snout itself. I know I'm going to need an edge there, so let's just start there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold down the shift key to draw a polygon in between all 4 of my green dots. And I'm on my way. Now I'm just going to hold down the tab key and just run a couple loops up here. All right, I'm going to protect my future self here a little bit. And remember that eventually I'm going to need to connect this center strip with my eye. So I'm going to start laying some foundation for that connection right now. And as I do this, what I'm looking over is that I'm saying, well, this vert right here could maybe potentially, or excuse me, this edge segment right here could bridge over to that one. That's a good place to go. Same with this one. That one could go there, and it likely will here in a minute. And we'll just add a couple more big ones in the back. Now I'm going to go in and do something similar to this ear loop. Then we'll conclude with the neck. Okay, we're only going to go to right about there in the neckline. Now for this neckline, I know that I need to have the flow of the polygons going north and south across the mesh like this. That's going to provide for natural deformation of the head tipping up and down. Wherever we want our model to bend, we facilitate that deformation with an edge. Okay, I think of these edges kind of like hinges, if you will, of the model itself. If we wanted to hinge at a specific location, well, we've got to have an edge there to define that area of rotation. Okay, just real quickly here. I'm going to hold down the Tab key and start working my way down. And you're probably starting to see why we want to keep it as chunky as we can, because we're already getting a mesh that's pretty intense. There's a lot going on in here. The face is absolutely the hardest part. So it's a good place to begin. It's a good place to begin this structure. I also like working with the faces because in every sense it defines the polygonal load of the rest of the model itself. If I discover that I need to have a lot of polygons in this part of my mesh to give me the result that I need, that's going to lead the decision making of how those polygons are going to flow and terminate way back here in the rear. So it's good to get that information first. I can't tell you how many times I've retopologized something where I've started on like the leg mistakenly. I was like, oh, I'll retopologize the leg real fast, and then I do all this work only to have that work be completely tossed because the requirements of the geometry of the head overwrites all the work that I had done on the leg. So start with the head. All right. And I'm going to add, it's getting a little wide here, so I'm going to taper it just a teeny tiny bit, and we'll stop there. Okay, good. That's a good structure. Before we start connecting these and look at how we can start to fill in these gaps, let's just take a step back for a second and examine what we've done. If you look carefully here, we've defined the boundaries of the areas in which we want to retopologize. We've also kind of described, if you will, the major features with their own loops, okay? The eye, it's a major feature. It's a circular shape, so we produce a circular loop. Nostril, same idea. The opening for the nostrils is a circular opening, so it needs to have a circular polyloop to define that shape. The jaw has its own loop. It's a primary feature, and we want the polygons flowing this way to define that shape. Imagine the topology of your mesh kind of like a topographical map. If you ever looked at a map of an environment with all the lines on it, that's a topographical map. The density and the closeness of all of those lines determines the slope of the mountain in that area. Well, we're fundamentally doing the exact same thing. The layout of all of the lines in our model define the slope of our geometry. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so I'm happy with this. This is starting to look pretty good. One small change here that I'm going to make to my eye and my nostril is just to make those polygons much bigger. They're too small. I'm going to go in and add a lot of geometry later. I'm just going to widen them significantly, which is going to make it a little bit easier for me to understand how all of these parts are going to connect to one another. I'm going to do the same thing for the nose as well. Just make them a little bit bigger. It's going to look weird, and that's okay. It's going to look weird by design, excuse me. Don't worry about the weirdness yet. All of that's going to get fixed. Retopologizing is a process of many, many, many edits. Okay, let's take a look-see back up here. I'm looking at the global density of all the polygons on my mesh, and yeah, this is starting to look pretty great. I would do the exact same thing for the rest of the major features. For example, I would go in and create a gigantic loop that goes around the shoulder blade right here inside of my mesh. I'd do the exact same thing for the tail. I'd make a loop that defines the tail and starts to create a polygonal structure that enhances and supports that feature. We're going to focus our attention on the head, but I'm in no way done. Yeah, this is looking really great. This is a fantastic beginning to our retopologizing workflow. Step number 1 is to define the features with their own loops. Also, be mindful that we're going to be doing this in symmetry. We're going to be using the mirroring tools to automatically produce the other half of the model, which makes connecting this a little bit easier.